progress.
Okay, so let's proceed with week 3 of our discussion. So the next topic that we have is, to show it to you. Okay, so license or permit fee versus taxation. So license or permit fee is a charge imposed under the police power or purpose of regularization. So basically, if for example you are planning to establish a business, you will be getting a business permit or a license to do business. Another is if you are planning to create or erect a building or to construct a house, you also need to get a business building permit or building license from your local government unit. So that is different from taxation. Next is there are 3 kinds of licenses which are recognized in our laws. Number 1, you have license for regularization of useful occupation. Okay, so that is, for example, your licenses, driver's license that you are trying to use, or for example, you have what you call the PTR or professional uh, taxes for your licenses. Okay, so that is one of the examples of that kind of licenses. Second is licenses for the regular or restriction of non-useful occupation or enterprises. An example of this is if, for example, you will sell um, liquors or alak, you also need to get license for that. And also, we also have what we call licenses for revenue. This is for the revenue purposes of the government or of your local government units. So importance of the distinction between taxes and licenses are some limitations apply only to one and not to the other, and that exception from taxes may not include exception from license fee. Number 2, that the power to regulate as an exercise of a police power does not include the power to impose fees for revenue purposes. So that is cited in the American Mail Line versus City of Butuan. So you can read that case so that you can further understand the situation in that case. Next is an extraction, however, may be considered both as taxes and as license fee. So it depends on how the law or how the ordinance was created. It will also be considered as a tax and a license fee. Next is but a tax may have only a regulatory purpose. So the reason why some, as we discussed previously, some taxation or some taxes that is being imposed to us as a citizen of this country is also for regulatory purposes, right? So again, regulatory so that the safety or the security or what do you call the protection of the general public is protected. An example of that is having a license to sell liquors, okay, and the excise tax, we also have that, or any licenses to operate casino. So those are the things that you have that you need to apply for if you're planning to enter into that kind of ventures. So another important distinction is the general rule is that the imposition is a tax if its primary purpose is to generate revenue and regulation is merely incidental. So, but if regulation is the primary purpose, the fact that incidental revenue is also obtained does not make the imposition of taxation. Okay? So meaning, if the primary purpose of the amount that you're paying is for revenue purposes or is for revenue and regulatory revenue, so meaning, okay, it is considered taxation if the main purpose is revenue para kumita yung gobyerno, right? But if the main purpose is to regulate, okay, which is the revenue is just incidental, that will be considered as license. Next. So what is the difference between license or taxation versus license or permit fee? So for taxation, enforced contribution assessed by a sovereign authority to defray public expenses. Okay, we have for revenue purposes, an exercise of taxing power of the state, generally no limit in the amount of tax to be paid, imposed also on persons and properties. Non-payment does not necessarily make the act business illegal, right? While for licenses, legal compensation or rewards of an officer or specific purposes. So usually yung building permit, binabayaran yan to also pay for the salaries of the people who are inspecting that building structure na ginagawa mo to ensure that you are complying with the standards of the building code. Next is for the purpose of regulation. Okay. Example again with the building permit. The reason why you have to get a building permit to ensure that you are following the building code. Next is an exercise of a police power of the state. So it is a power which the state wants to regulate and to ensure that you are following the protocols of the state. Kasi baka mamaya magtayo ng building, then what happened is substandard pala yung tinatayo mong building. So therefore, what will happen is there is a possibility of injury not only to the occupant of the building but also to third party or third person. Okay? The amount is limited to the necessary expenses of the inspection and regulation. Another that is the uh, fire permit or fire inspection permit. Okay, the amount that you're paying will go to the fund of the Bureau of Fire Protection to ensure also that you are complying with the fire code or the protection against fire laws that we have in our country. Next is we also have the imposition of imposed on the right to exercise a privilege. Again, as we mentioned in our previous discussion, okay, some of the acts that we are doing are just privileges, right? So if we want to construct a house on a lot, that is a privilege which the government also the government must regulate. Also, having a business or paying for having a business. That's the reason why the government is asking for a business permit because that is a privilege. Okay. And lastly, non-payment makes an act or a business illegal. Okay. So meaning if you are constructing a business, okay, if you're constructing a building, then you don't have any necessary building permit, therefore that act is illegal. Again, in my experience in the court, most of our cases that is being handled in the municipal trial court are violation of the building code, meaning you are constructing without a building permit. Okay. Next is okay. So next would be tax versus debt. Okay. Tax is based on law, while debt is based on a contract either express or implied. Pinagkasunduan niyan ng ibang tao o third party. Generally cannot be assigned. Okay, hindi mo pwedeng ipasa yung tax that is being charged to you, to your business or to your income. While in debt, pwede mo siyang i-assign to another person such as guarantors and so on. Generally payable in money, right? So as we discussed on our other weeks that we have, the taxes should be paid in a legal tender. Next is on debt may be paid in kind. So minsan pag wala nang pambayad yung umutang, minsan ang pinambabayad na lang are other things not considered as legal tender. In taxes, generally not subject to set off or compensation. Hindi pwedeng magpalitan, okay? Hindi mo pwedeng sabihin na hindi naman ako nakikinabang sa gobyerno so hindi ako magbabayad ng tax. Okay? So, with that, next, for debt may be subject to set-off or compensation. Ito yung sinasabing quits na lang. Right? Quits na lang dahil parehas naman kayong debtors and creditors of each other. Okay? So next we have what we have governed by special prescriptive period provided for the tax code, and the other is governed by the ordinary period of prescription. And what is the ordinary period of prescription? Siguro estudyante ko kayo last time in obligations and contracts, so therefore there are certain prescription on when the debt must be collected. Okay? Next, we also have does not draw interest except only when delinquent. Okay, so ibig sabihin walang interest na kailangan bayaran sa pagbabayad ng utang except kung ikaw ay late na sa pagbabayad. Doon lang magkakaroon ng penalties and surcharges. And I think the penalties and surcharges right now is about 25% of the amount due. Right? So ibig sabihin kung may utang ka, kung meron kang hindi nabayaran na halaga ng tax na halagang 10,000 pesos, therefore meron kang 2,500 pesos na penalty. While on a debt, draws interest when so stipulated or in case of default. So dati yung pinag-uusapan natin sa obligation and contract, if the interest is not stipulated in any instrument, therefore hindi pwedeng maningil ng interest. So, kailangan the interest is stipulated in your contract. Else, hindi pwedeng singilin ang interest kahit pinag-usapan nyo yan ng verbal. Okay? So debt is based upon a judicial tie, juridical tie, created by law, contracts, delict, or quasi-delict between parties for their private interests or resulting from their own act or commission. Okay? Next. Okay, debt versus tax. So the general rule, tax are not subject to set-off or legal compensation. The government and the taxpayer are not creditors and debtors of each other. Obligation is in the nature of debts are due to the government in its corporate capacity, while taxes are due to the government in its sovereign capacity. Ito yung diniscuss natin to nung isa sa mga case digest natin doon sa obligation and contract. Hindi pwedeng i-offset ang refund sa tax right away doon sa iyong tax obligation. Right? So kailangan pag in-assess ka ng tax, bayad ka muna. Hindi mo pwedeng sabihin na, ay teka, may protesta ako dyan sa tax na yan, hindi ko muna babayaran. No. You need to pay your taxes first bago ka magprotesta or bago ka magreklamo. Okay, the exception is where both the claims of the government and the taxpayer against each other have already become due and demandable as well as fully liquidated. So, kailangan meron kayong well-documented yung inyong liability to each other. So, for example, if you have a refund to the government, then you have an obligation to pay. So, pwede yung i-offset. An example of that is VAT, as I explained previously, na kung paano ba umairal ang VAT, sir, yung VAT input versus VAT, yung output VAT. Okay, so in Felix Mining versus Commissioner of Internal Revenue, the Supreme Court held that we have consistently ruled that there can be no offsetting of taxes against the claims that the taxpayer may have against the government. A person cannot refuse to pay a tax on the ground that the government owes him an amount equal or greater than the tax being collected. The collection of a tax cannot await the result of a lawsuit against the government. Ito yung sinasabi ko na hindi porket meron kang existing na demanda or meron kang existing claim against the government with regards to your overpayment of taxation, pwede mong sabihin sa gobyerno, ay hindi muna ako magbabayad ng tax because meron akong pending claim sa government. No, it will not. It does not work that way. And the Supreme Court already held hindi nga siya pwede. So kung meron kang tax payable, bayaran mo kaagad yung tax payable mo. Kung may complaint ka or meron kang refund, that is a different transaction. Tax distinguished from other terms, so subsidy, a pecuniary aid directly granted by the government to an individual or private commercial enterprises deemed beneficial to the public. An example of that is the 4Ps or yung Pantawid Pamilya Program na we have right now. I don't know if some of you are beneficiaries of this, but that is an example of subsidy. Next is we have revenue, refers to all the funds or income derived by the government, whether from taxes or from whatever sources and whatever manner they are collected for. Next, you have custom duties, taxes imposed on goods exported from or imported into the country. Their term taxes is broader in scope as it includes custom duty. So ito yung pag mag-i-import ka, meron kang additional na babayaran. Right? Kaya nga nagkaroon ng problema doon nung yung mga balikbayan box binubuksan ng customs. Right? Ang sinasabi no, ba't yung binubuksan para sa ano lang namin yan, para sa pamilya lang namin yan. But some incident kasi na yung mga pamilya or yung mga kababayan na natin na nasa ibang bansa, ang ginagawa nila, nagpapadala sila ng mamahaling gamit dito through balikbayan box. Then ang ginagawa ng mga relatives nila, after receiving it here in the Philippines, binibenta nila ng mahal. So pinagkakakitaan nila. Right? So that is a form of tax evasion. And we want to avoid that, kaya ginagawa ng customs yun. But during the time na nagkaroon ng bukasan ng balikbayan box, naging talamak naman yung corruption doon sa loob ng Bureau of Customs. That's the reason why kinwestiyon yan, right? Noong panahon na yun. Another term is a tariff. It may be used in three sense. One is as a book or rate drawn usually in alphabetical order, contain the name of several kinds of merchandise with the corresponding duties to be paid for the same. An example of that is if you will be purchasing imported products, okay, there is already a book existing in our Bureau of Customs kung magkano yung tax na kailangan mong bayaran doon or tariff na kailangan mong bayaran doon. As duty payable on the goods imported or exported, okay? And next is as the system or principle of imposing duties on the importation or exportation of goods. Next is we have the internal revenue, refers to the taxes imposed by the legislative other than duties or imports or exports. Okay? Next we have the margin fee, a currency measure designed to stabilize the currency. So usually nangyayari diyan dahil bumubuhos yung remittance sa ibang bansa papunta dito sa Pilipinas, lalo na during the Christmas season. So sometimes the government in need of funds, they do a margin fee. Okay? Kind of collection. Next is we have the tribute, synonymous to with taxes. Taxation implies tribute from the government to some form of sovereign or sovereignty. Then we have the impost. Okay, in its general sense, it signifies any tax, tributes, or duty. In its limited sense, it means a duty on importation of goods and services. Okay? Next, we will discuss the inherent power of the state. Ano ba yung kapangyarihan ng ating gobyerno na hindi kailangang nakalagay sa konstitusyon? Okay? So basically, we have the police power. Ito yung sinasabi natin, to the right of the government to limit, okay, the power of the government to limit the rights of the people. Next, we have the power of eminent domain, the right of the government to take the land or real property in the Philippines or in its territory with the exchange of a just compensation. And lastly, we do have what we call the taxation or power of taxation. These are the three inherent power of the state. Next is we will distinguish the different powers. So for the purpose in taxation, levy from the purpose of raising revenue. So that is the main purpose of taxation, to get revenue for the state so that the state can have money to pay for the expenses of having a government. Next is for the police power, okay, exercise to promote public welfare through regulation. Ito nga yung kinokontrol natin. Yung nililimitahan ng gobyerno ang karapatan ng tao para ma-regulate and to promote public welfare. Right? Next, we have eminent domain, taking of a property for public use. Okay? That is the purpose of those three powers. While amount of extraction in taxation, okay, in taxation, there is no limit as we mentioned earlier. Walang limit ang taxation. Actually, our tax laws are the mechanism, okay, for the government so that the government will be limited in collecting taxes. Right? Kakampi natin ang tax code because the tax code limits the power of the state to collect income or to collect their taxes. For the police power, it is limited to the cost of the regulation, issuance of the licenses or surveillance. Okay? So, yung purpose niya, limited lang doon. Hindi pwedeng sobra. Hindi sila dapat pwedeng kumita lang doon sa police power na yun. There should be limited to the cost of regulation, issuance of the licenses, or surveillance. While an eminent domain, no exaction or compensation paid by the government. So yung gobyerno pa yung nagbabayad doon sa eminent domain. For the benefit, no special or direct benefit received but the enjoyment of a privilege of living in an organized society. Okay? Yan yung purpose of benefit of taxation. The reason why we are paying taxes is that is the fee that we pay for having a civilized society. While for a police power, no direct benefit but a healthy economic standards of society or danum absque injuria is attained. Meaning, there is no injury. Okay? So, walang injury na na-attain sa atin. But that is what we pay for so that our economy is healthy and in standard. While in eminent domain, direct benefits result in the form of just compensation. Ano ba yung benepisyo? If the government takes your property, the government is required not only by our laws, but it is required by the Constitution that the government must pay you justly. Okay? Another distinction is the non-impairment of contracts. So the impairment rules subsist. So hindi dapat nakaka-impair ng obligation or ng contracts, private contracts. The contracts may be impaired for police power. So for example, if you are before imposing a certain law, okay, hindi siya illegal, but when the law was passed and tagging a certain products as an illegal item, therefore any contracts that will be affected by that law can be impaired. An example of that is right now vape is not illegal, but we don't know in the near future if the government decided to criminalize the use of vape, right? Kung may kontrata kang bumili ng vape, may kontrata kang magbenta ng vape, therefore that contract will be outlawed. So hindi mo na pwedeng i-implement yung kontrata na yun kasi nga it is already against the law. While on an eminent domain, contracts may be impaired. So kahit for example pinarerenta mo yung lupain mo, kaso ang gobyerno bigla niyang kukunin yung lupa mo, okay? So that contract of lease to your property, that would be impaired because of the eminent domain. For transfer of property rights, taxes paid become part of the public fund for taxation. While in police power, no transfer but only restraint on the exercise of the property rights exist, while an eminent domain property is taken by the government upon the payment of just compensation. For the scope, affects all persons, property, and excise, while for police power, affects all persons, property, privileges, and even rights. For eminent domain, affects only the particular property comprehended. So those are the scope of those three powers. And lastly, we have the basis. So the basis for taxation is public necessity, because if we don't have any taxes, our government will be paralyzed. While for police power, public necessity and the right of the state and the public to self-protect and self-preserve. While for eminent domain, public necessity, private property is taken for public use. And lastly, for authority, which the exercise of the power, only the government or the political subdivision, such as your local government, can implement taxation. While for the police power, only the government and its political subdivision, and for eminent domain, may be granted to public service, companies, or public utilities. So sino ba yung pwedeng kumuha ng property mo? So pwede din yung public service, companies, and public utilities. Pwede silang mag-eminent domain ng iyong property. Okay? Next. Limitation on the power of taxation. So limits classified for inherent limitation or those which restricts the power, although they are not embodied in the Constitution. So these are the limitation. The taxes should be collected only for public purpose of taxation or public purpose of taxes. Right? Dapat yung tax na kinokolekta is for public purpose. Right? Hindi ka pwedeng mangolekta ng taxes, then ang gagawin mo is yung taxes na nakolekta mo ay idodonate mo, let's say, sa isang religious organization. Yan, hindi po pwede yan. Okay? Kailangan for public purpose siya. Okay? Non-delegability of the taxing power, so hindi pwedeng i-delegate. So meaning, hindi pwedeng i-delegate ng gobyerno ang koleksyon ng taxes sa mga bangko. Meaning, hindi pwedeng yung bangko ang mag-charge sa inyo ng tax or ang mangolekta ng tax. Yes, you can use the collection or you can use the banks to collect the taxes, but that is only for collection purposes. Pero hindi pwedeng yung bangko ang magta-tax sa inyo or yung bangko ang mag-a-assess sa iyo ng tax. It's non-delegability. Territoriality or situs of the taxation. Okay, meaning our taxation is only effective in our country or in the territory of the Philippines. Okay? And also in our local government agency or local government units, the taxation that they are implementing is only limited to their territorial jurisdiction. So, for example, ang City of Manila, doon lang sila sa Manila pwedeng mag-tax. Ang Mandaluyong, sa Mandaluyong lang. Hindi sila pwedeng lumabas doon sa kanilang territory. Exemption of government taxes, exemption of the government from taxes. So, syempre, kung gobyerno ka, exempted ka doon sa taxes. It's like putting your money from your left pocket to your right pocket. So that's parang out of logic, right? So kung ang gobyerno ang kumikita, syempre yung gobyerno hindi niya tataksan yung sarili, right? International committee. So again, if there are agreements, treaties that talks about taxation, yan yung pinag-uusapan dyan. Okay, limitation of taxation. Okay, constitutional limitations are those expressly found in the Constitution or implied from its provision of public purpose of taxes. So, due process of law. Ibig sabihin, before you conduct any taxes, there should be a due process, right? In our jurisdiction here in the Philippines, if there is a tax or if there is a tax that the government wants to implement, so there should be a public hearing. After public hearing, it should go to the committee for I think it's Ways and Means. I don't know the correct committee that handles that in our Congress. Then after that, ipapasa nila yung batas. Pag naipasa nila yung batas, pipirmahan ng presidente. Pag napirmahan na ng presidente, after that, ipapublish nila sa official gazette or a newspaper of general circulation. And after that, once that the effectivity of that tax law uh, is published, that's the only time that it can be implemented. Hindi pwedeng hindi na pa-publish yung tax law na ginagawa sa atin, right? Equal protection of laws, so ibig sabihin lahat ng subject to tax should be equally protected. Hindi pwedeng itatax mo lang kasi Tagalog, itatax mo lang kasi Bicolano, right? Or exempted sa tax kasi mga Ilocano sila. So, hindi pwede yon. So the tax should be equal to everybody. Freedom of speech in the press. So next is non-infringement of religious freedom. Ito yung issue eh. Right? Ito yung issue kasi taxation is the power to destroy. Now, if the taxation is a power to destroy, then all of our religious sect or religious religion here in the Philippines, they are enjoying tax-free. Okay, wala silang binabayaran tax doon sa mga collection nila, sa mga tithes, doon sa mga contribution ng kanilang mga members, hindi tinatax yun, right? They don't even consider that as an income, right? Kaya mapapansin nyo, ang dami-daming reliyon dito sa Pilipinas, ang dami-daming sect dito sa Pilipinas, right? Because those religious sectors are not being taxed. Okay? Hindi sila tinataksan. Ngayon, if their income, let's consider the contribution of their members as income, if you tax them, and taxation is the power to destroy, therefore you destroy the freedom of religion. You infringe the freedom of the religious freedom. Therefore, that is an argument na that's the reason why we don't tax religious and educational institution, because it is a power to destroy. And if you are taxing the freedom of religion, okay, therefore, or the religious sect, therefore you are logically also infringing the right of religious freedom. Okay? So kaya hindi nga pwedeng yan ang sinasite na dapat hindi nagbabayad ng tax ang ating religious sector, religious institution. Pero if you think about it, I think about 20 to 30% of BPI is the stocks of BPI is owned by the Catholic Church, right? The Catholic Church of the Diocese of Manila is one of the richest dioceses in the Philippines, and they own a lot of properties, right? So those are the argument na dapat daw sila tinatax, but again, it is an infringement of religious freedom. Non-impairments of contract, right? So if the taxation will impair some of the contracts that you entered into, okay, that is a constitutional limitation. Okay, next is a constitutional limitation for public purpose of taxation. Another is non-imprisonment of debt or non-payment of poll tax. Yung non-payment of poll tax, kasi ito yung isang kaso, akala ko ba sinasabi nyo hindi dapat nakukulong pag hindi nagbabayad ng tax, nakalagay sa Constitution yan. Right? Pag utang lang, hindi ka dapat makukulong kasi nakalagay sa Constitution, walang kulong pag utang lang. Okay? But for tax purposes, pag sinabing poll tax, ito yung ang definition nga nito parang yung sedula. Yan, yung poll tax, yung sedula, right? So pag hindi ka nagbayad ng sedula, okay lang na hindi ka dapat makukulong. But if you refuse to pay your income tax, iba 'yon. Business tax, iba 'yon. So tax evasion ang tawag doon. So therefore, makukulong ka doon. right? Because if you don't pay that, you are restricting the government of its right collection of revenue. Therefore, it will affect the operation of the government. Hindi sila makakakolekta, right? Origin of appropriation, revenue, and tariff. So those are the limitations. Uniformity, equitability, and progressivity of taxation. Ito nga yung habang lumalaki yung income mo, lumalaki din yung tax sa'yo. Delegation of legislative authority to fix tax rates, tariff rates, importation, export quotas. Right? It should be the legislature who is authorized to implement those tax rates. Then tax exception of properties actually directly and exclusively used for religious and charitable institution. Hindi mo sila pwedeng taxan. But the restriction here or the exception here is the educational, religious, and charitable institution, hindi mo sila pwedeng taxan doon sa mga activity nila for the purpose of religious, education, and charitable or in charity. Hindi mo sila pwedeng taxan doon. But if the activity of a religious, educational, or charitable institution is already for revenue, then that's the time that you can tax them. Okay? Next is, okay. Next is voting requirement in connection with the legislative grant of tax exception. So hindi pwede 'yon. Hindi pwedeng maging requirement ang pagbabayad ng tax para makaboto ka. Next is non-impairment of the Supreme Court's jurisdiction in tax cases. So hindi pwedeng sabihin, bawal yung Supreme Court makialam sa taxation. No, hindi pwede yan. Another is tax exception of revenue and assets, including grants, endowment, donation, or contribution to educational institution. So that is also an exception. Limitation, other constitutional provision in relation to taxation. So subject to the title of the bill, theoretical justice, the tax burden should be in proportion to the taxpayer's ability to pay principle in the 1987 Constitution. Power of the President to veto an item in the appropriation, revenue, or tax bill. Next is necessity of an appropriation made for money. Appropriation for public money. Next is tax levied for special purposes allotment to the local government unit. Kaya nila gustong mangyari yung federalism. Kasi ang nangyayari sa atin, lahat ng koleksyon ng bawat bayan dito sa Pilipinas nire-remit sa BIR. Ngayon, sa BIR, kinokolekta yan, then kung magkano yung nakolekta ng BIR, yun yung binabalik doon sa mga tao. So, umaakit muna sa central government, then after yun, bababa. The problem is, kung hindi ka kakampi ng presidente, therefore, minsan yung probinsya mo napapabayaan. Right? Minsan yung bayan mo napapabayaan kung talagang kalaban ka. Right? So, ang gusto mangyari sa federalism is, magbibigay na lang yung kinita nung kinita ng bayan na yon, okay, yung kinita ng bayan na yun, mareretain na lang dun sa bayan. Tapos, ang mangyayari, yung matitira, or yung certain percentage, yun na lang yung binabalik nila sa kanilang federal government. Ganun ang gusto mangyari sa federalism. Right? Para nga, yung pera, ma-retain doon sa bayan, hindi na umakyat doon sa local government, hindi na umakyat sa national government. An inherent limitation of taxing power. So first is let's discuss the important points to consider. So if taxation is for a public purpose, the tax must be used, number one, for the purpose for the support of the state or some recognized objects of the government, or directly to promote the welfare of the community. So tax as an implement of police power. So dapat in support of the state ng ating gobyerno. And if not, it can be for a recognized object of the government. What are those objects? So for example, our local government unit, or yung iba naman is yung healthcare services natin, right? The universal healthcare and so on and so on. So inherent limitation, the term public purpose is synonymous with governmental purpose. A purpose affecting the inhabitants of the state or taxing district as a community and not merely as an individual. A tax levied for a private purpose constitute a taking of the property without due process of law. The processes to be accomplished by taxation needs not be exclusively public. Although private individuals are directly benefited, the tax would still be valid provided such benefit is only incidental. The test is not as to who receives the money, but the characteristic of the purpose for which it is expended. Okay? Not to immediately result of the expenditure, but rather the ultimate in the imposition of taxes, public purpose is presumed. Diba? Ito yung sinasabi natin, public purpose. Hindi porket sinabi mong public purpose, dapat lahat ng tao nakikinabang. Right? Kagaya ng 4Ps. Right? 4Ps or yung Pantawid Pamilya Program, dapat the purpose of that is for public purpose. But I'm not a beneficiary of that. Hindi naman ako beneficiary ng 4Ps. Right? Thankfully. Diba? Thankfully, hindi ako beneficiary ng 4Ps. But, pwede ko bang sabihin, hindi naman ako beneficiary ng 4Ps, ba't ako magbabayad niyan? Right? No, I cannot say that because the mere fact na hindi ka nagbe-benefit dun sa programa ng gobyerno yon, it is not an excuse for you not to pay that tax that is due. Okay? Next. Another inherent limitation is test in the determining public purpose in taxation. So number one is duty test, where the thing to be threatened by the appropriation of public revenue is something which it is the duty of the state as a government. So duty ba talaga? Okay, duty ba talaga ng state na mag-provide para doon sa purpose na yon, right? Is that really the duty of the state, right? And in the Pantawid Pamilya Program, it is the duty of the state to help the people, the poorest of the poor, right? To help them alleviate in poverty, right? So that is a duty of the state. Next is promotion of general welfare test. Whether the law provides the tax directly promotes the welfare of the community in equal measure. An example of that is yung sin tax, right? Yung sin tax, it is being taxed on liquors, cigarettes, and other vices, right? Tinataksan yan. Now, pwede ba naming sabihin yung mga naninigarilyo, yung mga umiinom ng alak, oh, that is unfair, bakit kami lang ang tinataksan nyo? Right? Para saan ba yan? Basically, the tax that is being collected by sin tax, napupunta yan sa health program ng gobyerno. Right? Doon sa universal healthcare program ng gobyerno. Right? So it promotes the general welfare of the citizens of the Philippines. Next limitation, basic principle of the sound tax system. We have discussed this already, but we will discuss it in details further. So fiscal adequacy, the sources of tax revenue should coincide with and approximate the needs of the government expenditures, neither an excess nor a deficit of revenue vis-a-vis the need of government would be in keeping with the principle. So meaning dapat yung kinokolektang tax ng ating BIR is in accordance to the needs of the government, right? Dapat may yung nakokolekta sa atin ginagamit ng gobyerno at hindi dapat yung collection nila kulang lagi. Right? Next. Administrative feasibility, the tax law should be capable of convenient, just, and effective administration. Constitution requires tax to be equitable and uniform. So ngayon, because of nare-realize na ng gobyerno na o medyo wag na nating papilahin yung mga nagbabayad ng tax. So ang nangyayari, pwede nang magbayad ng tax ngayon online. But before that, dati hindi ka nakakapagbayad ng tax online. But ngayon pwede na because of this is one of the effect of the pandemic na na-consider na ng gobyerno na o sige nga, let's open our options dyan sa mga online payments na yan. Next is the non-delegability of taxing power. The rationale of this is the doctrine of separation of power. Taxation is purely legislative. Congress cannot delegate the power to others. So ang gumagawa ng taxation natin, isang mga congressman natin at ang mga senador natin. Right? Dahil sila ang gumagawa ng tax natin, sila rin ang nagde-determine ng rate, sila ang nagde-determine kung paano, sila ang nagde-determine kung saan ang at kung ano-ano pang issue ng taxation. Hindi nila pwedeng sabihin na ay hindi sige hayaan na lang natin yung presidente, right? Hayaan na lang natin yung presidente na siya yung mag-decide kung paano ko kolektahin yung taxes, kung sino ang i-exempt niya sa taxes, no? So because the taxation is non-delegable or hindi siya pwedeng i-delegate, therefore it is purely our legislative ang magde-decide nun. Ang ginagawa lang naman ng ating presidente or ang executive branch of the government is to implement those laws. Next, the exception of non-delegability of taxing power, so the delegation to the president, that is in Article 6 of Article 6, Section 28, Paragraph 2 of the 1987 Constitution, the power granted to the Congress under this constitutional provision to authorize the President to fix within specified limits and subject to such limitations and restrictions as it may impose tariffs, rates, and other duties, and imposed includes tariffs, rates, even for revenue purposes only. Custom duties which are assessed at the prescribed tariff rates are very much like taxes which are frequently imposed for both revenue raising and regulatory purposes. If you want to understand that discussion, you can go to Garcia versus Executive Secretary so that you can read the full case. Next exception is the delegation to the local government or yung ating mga bayan, city, province, right, municipalities. So there is delegation to our local government. It has been held that the general principle against delegation of legislative power as a consequence of the theory of separation of power is subject to one's well-established exception, namely the legislative power may be delegated to a local government. Okay? The theory of non-delegation of legislative power does not apply in the matter of local concern. An example of that is yung ating sangguniang bayan or sangguniang lungsod or sangguniang panlalawigan. So, yung mga sanggunian natin, they are legislative representative of the said state, of the said province, city, or municipality. So they are vested with delegated power to impose taxes or to create ordinances, okay, for taxing purposes. Another exception is delegation to administrative agency with respect to aspect of taxation non-legislative in character. Example, assessment and collection. So, an example of that is the BIR has a delegated power, okay, to assess taxation and to collect those taxes. Hindi na kailangan yung Congress ang magko-kolekta ng taxes. Hindi pag kinolekta ng Congress yung mga taxes natin, napunta na sa kung saan-saan yun, right? So the BIR is delegated to collect and assess our taxes. Okay? The BIR can also decide on how to pay those taxes or how to collect those taxes. Right? It is already purely administrative. Next, we have the limitation on delegation. Okay, so it shall not contravene to any constitutional provision or inherent limitation of taxation. The delegation is effected either by the Constitution or by valid enactment of legislative measure or statute. And the delegated levied power, except when the delegation is by an express provision of the Constitution itself, should only be in favor of the local legislative body of the local or municipal government concerned. So this is an additional uh, limitation of the delegated power to the local government unit. So tax legislation versus tax administration. So every system of taxation consists of two parts. The element that enter into the imposition of tax or tax regulation, and number two, the steps taken for its assessment and collection or tax administration. If, okay, what is delegated is tax legislation and the delegation is valid. So kung yung paggawa ng tax, pagdedeklara ng rate ng tax, or pag-identify kung sino ang itatax, that is an invalid delegation by the legislature. But if what is involved is only tax administration, then the non-delegatory rule is not violated. Kung paano kukolektahin yung taxes at kung kailan magbabayad ng taxes, pag yun ang dinelegate doon sa BIR, eh hindi siya violation ng non-delegatory rule. Okay. Territorial or situs of the taxation, important points to consider. Okay, the grounds for the above rule are the sovereign equality among states, usage among states, that when one enters into the territoriality of situs of taxation, means place of taxation, depending on the nature of the tax being imposed, it is an inherent mandate that taxation shall only be exercised on persons, properties, and excise within the territory of the taxing power. So, pag may pumasok sa Pilipinas na mga produkto, for example, then they are subject to taxation unless there is a international committee, right? Or treaty that they are subject to tax exception. Tax laws do not operate beyond the country's territorial limits. So for example, tayong mga Pilipino, pag nagpunta ka sa ibang bansa at kumita ka sa ibang bansa, the BIR hindi ka pwede nilang habulin because it is already outside the territorial limits of our country, okay, or our jurisdiction. Property which is wholly and exclusively within the jurisdiction of another state receives none of the protection of which a tax is supposed to be compensation. So, yung, let's say you have a property, yung kay Manny Pacquiao, for example. Si Manny Pacquiao, meron siyang mansion sa California, right? Now, yung mansion na yon is hindi pwedeng taksan ng BIR dito sa Pilipinas, right? Because it is already outside the jurisdiction of the Philippines. And, okay, that property in California, it is already outside the limitation, outside the territory of the Philippines, and hindi yan mapoprotektahan ng state ng Pilipinas. Kasi nga, nasa California siya. Okay? However, the fundamental basis of the right to tax is the capacity of the government to provide benefit and protection to the object of the tax. A person may be taxed even if he is outside the taxing state, where there is between him and the taxing state and a privity of relationship is justifying the levy. An example is, although nasa ibang bansa ka, pero nagpapadala ka dito sa Pilipinas, pero yung pinapadala mo dito sa Pilipinas are imports, binibenta mo dito sa Pilipinas. Therefore, pwede ka pa rin taksa ng gobyerno. Another example of that is yung mga panalo ni Manny Pacquiao nung laban niya. Right? Pag dinala niya, nung nanalo siya sa ibang bansa, nung umuwi siya dito sa Pilipinas, Manny Pacquiao is subject to pay taxes on his winnings in his fight. Okay? Next is the factor to consider in determining situs of taxation, kind of classification of the tax location of the subject matter of the tax. domicile, or residence of the person, citizenship, or of the person source of income, place where the privilege, business, or occupation is being exercised. Okay, exception of the government from taxes. So the important points to consider is why there is a reason, or what is the reason why the government is exempted from paying taxes. Okay? To levy tax upon the public property would render necessarily new taxes on other public properties of the payment of the tax so laid, and thus the government would be taxing itself to raise money to pay over itself. So ito yung sinasabi nga natin, getting the money from your right pocket and putting it on your left pocket. So kaya bakit mo patataksan yung sarili mo? Ikaw naman din yung nangongolekta ng taxes. Right? That is one of the reason. In order that the function of the government shall not be unduly impede. Right? Kasi kung ang gobyerno tataksan mo, asikasuhin niya pa yon. Right? So para hindi na ma-delay yung mga functions niya as a government. Next is to reduce the amount of money that has to be handed by the government in the course of the operation. O kaya tayo may mga General Appropriations Act. So to reduce the money that is being handed to the government by itself. Okay? Next pointer to consider is unless otherwise provided by law, the exception applies only to government entities through which the government immediately and directly exercises its sovereign power. Okay? So yung sa kanya lang. Okay, yung kung saan lang siya i-impose ng kanyang power dun sa kanyang authority or territory. Now, notwithstanding with the immunity, the government may tax itself, okay, in the absence of any constitutional limitation. Pwede pa rin naman taksan ng gobyerno yung sarili niya. But yun nga, parang illogical yung dating niya. Next is government-owned and controlled corporation when the performing proprietary function are generally subject to tax in the absence of tax exemption provision in their character or law creating them. So usually, yung mga government-owned and controlled corporation such as SSS, PhilHealth, right? So that those GSIS, so those are government-owned corporation, right? Without any exception in their charter, dapat silang tinataksan. Kahit kumikita sila ng pera, okay? Kumikita ng pera ng revenue yung government-owned and controlled corporation na yon, right? If it is stated in their charter na hindi sila dapat magbayad ng tax, therefore hindi dapat sila magbayad ng tax. But in the absence of that stipulation, in the law that create them, kailangan nilang mag-tax. Kailangan nilang magbayad ng tax. Okay? And lastly, international committee, important point to consider, the property of a foreign state or government may not be taxed by the other. So for example, yung US Embassy, right? The US Embassy in I think that is in Rojas Boulevard, hindi 'yon nagbabayad ng property tax. Kasi nga, it is an international committee. Territory of another, there is an implied understanding that the power does not intend to degrade its dignity by placing itself under the jurisdiction of the latter. So basically pag nasa US Embassy ka, as if that is an extension of the United States of America. So if you are taxing them because of they stay there, so that is something that is degrading the dignity of that jurisdiction. That's the reason why we do not tax them. Foreign government may not be sued without the consent so that it is useless to assess the tax since it cannot be collected. Okay? So hindi mo pwedeng idemanda ang foreign state pag wala silang consent. Okay? And sa international law, sa constitutional law, pinag-uusapan namin yan, you cannot sue another state pag hindi sila nag-consent. Usually, hindi naman sila nagko-consent sa na-idemanda mo sila unless they are stopped from claiming that immunity. For example, pumasok sila sa kontrata, Right? The mere fact na pumasok sila sa kontrata as a private person, not a state, and that's the time that you can also sue them. And lastly, the reciprocity among states. So usually, we have reciprocity that our Philippine embassy is not being taxed in the United States. So therefore, the U.S. embassy will not be taxed here in the Philippines. And that is what you call the reciprocity among our among the states. Okay, so that ends our week 3, and please review, and we will have our quiz next meeting. Okay?